Hello and welcome to another NihongoGamer video. As you know, I've been checking out large numbers of controllers lately, and one of them has been the Hori Fighting Commander Octa. This is a specific pad for fighting games, or aimed at people who play fighting games. But I also got this. This is the Horipad Pro, and it's designed for Xbox Series X, but I will be using it on PC today because I don't even actually own an Xbox. Now, the curious thing about this product is that it's one of those controllers that isn't trying to be anything specific. This controller that they sent me, Hori also sent me this, and it's in a separate video. This is aimed at people who want to play fighting games. You can tell because instead of having 4 face buttons, it's got 6 face buttons. It's got mechanical switches or micro switches built into it. It actually does have a few features that are similar to the other products that I've been looking at from Hori, and it's the ability to remap the buttons. Now, depending on the version of the software, this has been like less or more versatile, so we'll have to wait until we actually download the software and try it out to see how mappable these buttons actually are. And it looks like you actually have a fair amount of customizability regarding the sensitivity of these analog sticks as well. I'll tell you what, actually, one of the main things I'm excited about this is the ability to swap the left and right analog stick. I don't know if you can do that on regular controllers that come with your console. Let's get it out of the box, pull that out of there, there's nothing left to... Woo! Alright, and this is the professional, the Horipad Pro in here. Ta-da! Ooh! Quite like the little green surrounds on here. Aesthetically, I think it's actually quite pleasing. So let's have a closer look at the Horipad Pro. You've got your left analog stick, right analog stick, you've got your D-pad, you've got your standard face buttons, your shoulder buttons. So the thing about this controller is that if I were playing fighting games, I would probably just buy the Fighting Commander Octa. And I think price-wise, they're actually priced at a similar price point. So there's no gate on this controller, but this is obviously the one that I would choose if I want to be playing games with 2 analog sticks and just a general, general standard pad shape. Like, for example, the Fighting Commander Octa only has digital buttons here on the shoulder pads, but on the Horipad Pro, it looks like it's got the traditional analog triggers where you can like push a little bit or push strongly. Now, one thing that does interest me is that if I do want to use this for fighting games, so let's say that I don't want to buy 2 pads. Let's say I just want to spend $50 on a pad and get one that actually plays all my games, but also I can use for fighting games. I want to see how good this D-pad is because I can't tell from pressing it now. It just feels like the standard Hori D-pad, but I want to make sure that it doesn't actuate in the center, because some of the D-pads that I receive, like, they actuate in the center and you're not able to actually roll your fingers to other buttons without lifting your thumb back off the pad. Now, I've actually got the previous generation of Fighting Commander here, and it's got like a sort of concave feel to the D-pad, but it's pretty standard. It does the job, and it does the job quite well. This feels concave as well. It's got a slightly different shape to the Generation 1 Fighting Commander, but we will see how it feels in practice. In general, these shoulder buttons and these face buttons, they feel very light. Like, the controller doesn't feel heavy, doesn't feel weighty, and I don't feel a lot of resistance. It certainly has like a light, hollow quality to it. And these analog sticks, interestingly, they make quite an audible sort of knock when you hit them against the edge. For reference, on a standard like PS4 pad, oh, well, okay, on a PS4 pad, it's a little bit more muted, but it still does make sound. And a couple last things before we actually plug it in. It has got a headset port on the base if you want to chat to your friends and listen to them while you're playing games. And also, let's check out this wired cable, because that's one of the main things about why you would buy this pad. Like, you could just buy the standard controller from the console manufacturer if you wanted a wireless controller, but if for some reason you need a wired pad, then this has a cable about this long, and it goes pretty much over to that wall. So I'm guessing it's something like 3 meters, 9 feet, 10-foot cable-ish. Now, without even plugging it in, it feels quite pleasant to hold, but these sticks, they do feel very, like, tall. It kind of reminds me of the analog stick on this. It's not a Horipad Pro. This is the original one that was called just the Horipad, and the main feature about this was you could remove the D-pad for whatever reason. It also had these Hori analog sticks, and they're very, very tall. I just feel like I'm more used to the DualShock 4, which has, I feel like they're very ever so slightly shorter, and so as a result, they don't feel like they go quite as far. They don't travel quite as long an arc. Anyway, I think we should go ahead and plug it straight in and try some games with this, the Horipad Pro. Alright, I've got the Horipad Pro here, and the first thing I want to do is plug it in and see whether we've got any updates. All right, we're plugged in, and there's the controller. It has recognized it as the Horipad Pro for the Xbox Series XS version 1.1.9. All right, after a quick look at the Hori website, it looks like there are no firmware updates available, so let's just jump straight into the software. So you've got 4 separate profiles. You've got green, red, blue, and sort of beige. Go over here to the editing page, and I'm going to go to profile number 1, edit. Let's see what we can actually do here. Button mapping. It looks like you can change only the shoulder buttons. That's a little bit of a shame because I mean, I don't really see any reason to restrict it to only the shoulder buttons, but just for kicks, let's see what we can actually change. Okay, interesting. So you can change the shoulder buttons to be any other of these options here. So A, B, X, Y, any of the 4 cardinal directions. You can set it to any of the normal shoulder button features, but you can also set it as a left stick click or right stick click, which is normally when you would like click this stick in. What I do want to know is, does it swap? Because this was an issue in previous versions of the software, but if you set the buttons to be like left over here, then you would lose the ability to use left on the D-pad. Let's hope that isn't the case. Good. If you set your like shoulder button to be left, you don't actually remove left from the D-pad. That's a good, in my opinion, that's a good thing. But if you really wanted the ability to set like left shoulder buttons or right shoulder buttons to this and use it like a C-stick, like, you know, on a GameCube controller, it doesn't look like you're able to do that. You can only set these 4 buttons. It no longer does button swapping. The next thing I want to try is the analog stick settings. Okay, so you see that little red dot getting bigger there. That is the range in which nothing will be registered. So I can play around in this red zone and nothing will actually happen, but it's when I go out of the red zone that you'll actually, the dead zone rather, where you'll actually register clicks. So that's nice. If you like to rest your thumb on the analog stick and you tend to fidget around and you think it's too sensitive, you can actually reduce or increase the dead zone. So it's like basically the whole thing. That's cool. Set that back to 0. Other things you can change in here are reverse horizontal. Why would you want to do this? I'm sure there is a reason why you would want to do this, but if you set it to this, you can set right. It will actually send the controller to the left, and if you go left, it will send the controller to the right. That is, there's gotta be a reason why you would want to do this. And then you can also reverse vertical. So pressing up would normally go up and down, but if you set reverse vertical, pressing up goes down and pressing down goes up. So I can imagine this is useful if you're playing a flight simulator and it's locked into inverted mouse mode. Like, this has been a thing in first-person shooters and flight simulators since the beginning of time. Do you like to control it like an actual pilot in a plane where you pull back to go up and you push forward to go down, because that's what you would be doing like in a plane? Or do you like to press up to go up and press down to go down? If you happen to be playing a game that for some reason doesn't let you invert the mouse, the Y direction, but I'm pretty sure most games do allow you to do that. If you are playing a game that doesn't allow you to do that, then you can use this feature in the Hori software to lock it into the controller to inverse the vertical axis. And that's pretty cool. Target settings. What is this? All right, I'm having trouble trying to figure out how the software works, but there's no manual inside the box. All right, it took me a little while to figure this out because there's no instruction manual, and even the instruction manual that does exist doesn't really explain it. But basically, target settings is the opposite of dead zone adjustment. So dead zone allows you to change how big the area of sort of nothing will happen area, that red zone there in the middle. That is the dead zone adjustment. But if you leave that on 0 and you go over to target settings, you can change it between full motion. Can you see? I get full analog motion from the dead zone all the way out to the outer rim. But if I click on target settings, it will restrict it to whatever's set down here, 50%, 0, 100%, whatever in between. And if I press all the way on the analog stick, it will only go halfway out to the outer rim. So if you are finding that you're in a game that is just, you're pressing all the way onto the analog stick and it's going way further than it needs to go, then you can just set it here. You can just force it to only go to something like, I don't know, I think most of the time you'd probably set it to something like, I don't know, 80%. And that way, even though the Horipad is capable of going all the way out here, you can lock it so that it will only go as far as 80%, so you don't actually like turn too quickly or something. Now, one more thing that's kind of interesting is this one. It's called Agile Button Settings. Now, normally you've got analog control like this, but if you click Agile Buttons, it actually locks it into only 8 of these cardinal and sort of diagonal directions. So it's basically a digital mode for an analog stick. What I'm curious to see is, can I use dead zone adjustment and agile button settings at the same time? Will it let me use agile button settings so that only 50%? Yes! Oh, interesting. It does work. So even though I'm moving within the dead zone here on my thumb, you can see nothing is happening. But when I go 50% of the way, it locks it immediately into one of these 8 cardinal or diagonal directions. This is nice to have a contrast between this and the Fighting Commander Octa, because this has a gate on it, but I don't believe you had as much control over the dead zone or anything. On this pad, if you want to use just a standard analog stick, which is nice and circular like this, but you don't want to accidentally activate diagonal down when you really wanted to just press forward, then you can use this feature in the app to make sure that you've got that dead zone nice and large, so it's only when you actually, with intentionality, push forward or push down forward that you get that direction. And last but not least, the feature that I'm kind of the most interested in is this, reverse the analog stick. So I've got obviously left analog stick and right analog stick, but if I activate this one, it will change it so that the right analog stick now thinks it's on the left side for the directions, and the left one thinks it's on the right side for aiming, let's say if you're in a first-person shooter. Now if we go back to the main menu and check out the trigger settings, you also have the ability to kind of, oh, interesting. This is really nice, actually. I don't know if you can do this on the controllers that ship with the consoles. I mean, maybe you can, but this is nice to have customizability over the actual travel of these trigger buttons, because what I'm doing right now is, like, you can see I'm pushing and pushing, nothing's happening, and then it activates the lowest part of it, and then very quickly it starts ramping up the values of this analog trigger, which, let's say that I want to change it. Let's have the minimum value 50%, right? With even just a small amount of pressure, it jumps straight up to 50% without going through that value down at the base. And if I go all the way and I set this to instantly jump up to, let's say, 99%, let's see how that works. So I'll push very gently on the trigger, nothing, and as you can see, instantly goes straight up. So there's no ramping at all. It's just like very, there's like nothing, and then actuate, bang. Then if we set it back to defaults, you can see that it goes all the way back to having all of that motion in between 0 and 100. I have to say, it ramps up very quickly. I don't know if they wanted it to ramp up a little more slowly, but I don't see any way to change the sensitivity on that. I guess if you change this setting on the maximum, if we change this over to 50%. All right, I see. So if you set the maximum value to 50, what it actually does is it does go all the way to its maximum setting, but it just reaches it earlier. So you don't have to push as far on the analog trigger before you reach 100%. Even more drastically, if I set this all the way down to the bottom, so instead of having nothing, and then suddenly reaching full value right at the end, hopefully it'll reach like full value right at the start of the travel of the trigger. You can see that, right? So I'm pressing very lightly, and it's already reaching 100% before I'm anywhere near the end of the travel. There's still plenty of travel after the point where we reach 100% after that. So if you don't like pushing all the way down on the triggers to actuate them 100%, you can set these maximum values down, so it's just like you can have a much lighter touch, and you don't have to push quite as hard. For example, if you're playing a fighting game and you like these analog triggers, but you don't like having to push all the way down just to actuate the buttons, like having the actuation point much higher like this is going to actuate them much quicker. I say much quicker, ever so slightly quicker. And last but not least, you are able to flip them around. You can do this in button mapping as well, but I think it would be slightly different because these are analog triggers. But when you press reverse trigger input, now the right trigger changes the left setting, and if you press the left trigger, changes the right setting. You've got some various audio settings. This is standard stuff, microphone sensitivity, mute volume. You can also, while you're using the controller, you can hold down these buttons here and press up and down on the D-pad, I believe, and you can change the sensitivity while you're using it. If you want a controller vibration setting changed, you can do it right here. Yeah, it changed a little bit. Trigger vibration? I didn't know the triggers had vibration. I don't know if this is something I would ever use, but I guess it could be nice when you're like holding down the accelerator and you're driving and it feels like, you know, the whole car is rumbling. Anyway, it's time to actually try some games. So I'm going to set this back to default. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change profile 2. So I'm going to change to reverse the analog sticks on here. All right, so I've got my 2 profiles set up. Basically the default controller, but the other one is with the left stick and the right stick swapped. So I can try some one-handed gaming. All right, so I've got Street Fighter V booted up here. Again, this is not really the controller I would choose to play fighting games just because there is a controller already dedicated for playing fighting games. But if you can only buy one and you want the controller that has 2 analog sticks, you might want to know, can you also play fighting games on this? So I'm just moving around with my analog stick here, but let's also move around with the D-pad and let's see how that feels. The main thing I want to try first is, can you press down in the center of the controller? And fortunately, it is good. Okay, you want to not be able to press down in the center of the D-pad. It looks like you can press down in the center of it, but you're actually still able to activate all the directions by rolling around. There are some D-pads where you push down in the middle and then suddenly no more inputs can be pressed unless you've let go of the center of the D-pad and you start pressing down again. But this is acting just like the Hori joypad decon or the original Fighting Commander, where you can, you can press down on the D-pad and you can still rock left and right and actually have the inputs come in, as opposed to other controllers where, once you're pressing down, no more inputs can be entered. It feels like you would expect on either the original Fighting Commander or the Horipad joypad decon, and so in a way it's not quite as nice as the D-pad that is on this one. This is the controller that's designed for fighting games. It's the Fighting Commander Octa, but in terms of performance, at least it does function properly. It feels a little mushier by comparison because it's going back to the original style of the Fighting Commander D-pad. But I've always liked this. I've always liked this D-pad. It's just I probably wouldn't choose it now that I've got the Octa. But in terms of motions, you can do all the things that you should be able to do with a controller like this. I can do my dragon punches. I can do my fireballs, Tatsumaki. Alright, yeah, seems fine so far. Alright, now one more thing we can try is the analog stick, and like I mentioned before, I feel like the analog sticks on the Horipads and the Horipad Pro, I feel like they're a little bit taller than I'm used to on a DualShock. Some people may like that, maybe that gives you more fine-grained control, but personally, I prefer the lower analog sticks of just a standard DualShock controller. Pretty standard. But now it's time for the test you've all been waiting for. It's time for profile number 2. Alright, let's see if we can use the right analog stick for movement and play this game one-handed. I'm gonna have my left hand up here and we're going to see if I can wave to the crowd, because, obviously you gotta wave to the fans, while I try and do a dragon punch with my right thumb. This is important. This is an experiment for accessibility. Awesome, I can do it. Normally I would press forward and light kick at the same time when I'm doing this dragon punch, but I can't do it with one hand. So I think if I wanted to do this, I would have to use like a claw method like this, so I can press buttons and directions at the same time. But at that point, if you're going to use like a claw method like this, then you may as well just have your thumb here on the left. But still, I'm curious to see how far I can go with the standard grip and my thumb over here. It's too hard. It's too hard. Okay, let's try something simpler first. Let's do just a standard fireball, shall we? Okay, one-handed gaming is a lot harder than I was expecting. I need to be holding down like this while I press certain buttons. Oh, I got one, and that was using a sort of claw grip. I'm just doing this just to be silly, but the main difficulty of playing with a controller one-handed, even though this is a cool thing that you can do with this, is that you need to be able to press directions and buttons at the same time for certain combos, or just simple things like, crouching and doing a kick at the same time. And for that, holding it like this is probably not going to work unless you had like 6 buttons here that you could all press with your fingers, but instead I'm limited to only these 2 shoulder buttons unless I use like a claw grip like this, in which case like this is not the ideal position for my thumb. So anyway, as a fun experiment, it was funny, but it's clearly not the way to use this controller. okay, I'm playing with the analog stick. I guess I probably wouldn't, but I think there's one thing that I probably do need to mention about this controller is that the D-pad is down here in the Xbox placement. So normally on a PlayStation controller, the D-pad is up here where the buttons are. And I personally, because I play on the D-pad, it just means that my left thumb is in the same place as my right thumb over here. But when you play on this is kind of like the Switch Xbox layout. Xbox and Nintendo, they prefer to have the D-pad down here, and so you're like kind of in this weird shape where you're like your thumb is coming down here on the left side, but it's up here on the right side. So that's totally up to you. But basically, I think you know this setup is more for people who are playing first-person shooters. There's not too much to say about the controller apart from it's got your standard analog sticks. They feel kind of high. The D-pad feels like standard D-pad Joy-Con stuff, so it's an upgrade over Joy-Cons, but I don't know, it's not exactly like the most responsive D-pad of all time or anything. It's just, it works and it works well. I suppose if you want to be really detailed about it, maybe if compared to like the Horipad, the Horipad has a slightly more angle coming outwards, a bit like an Xbox controller. I feel like this controller feels a little bit closer to a Nintendo Pro controller. All right, let's play something random. How about Crazy Taxi? Let's see how this feels on the controller.
Here we go!
Go! No, I missed. All right, let's go. Hey, this looks actually not bad. Interesting. Okay, so I'm feeling like the flippers, the shoulder trigger buttons, they are quite small. Ah! I feel like my finger is kind of falling off the flipper pad here a little bit. It's kind of, instead of pressing on here, it's kind of, my finger wants to rest here on the pad. It's interesting. If you don't mind the music being completely wrong, it's alright. Generally speaking, I like the buttons. They're membrane buttons, so it's not like the Fighting Commander. But for a controller like this, I actually prefer the buttons to just be the standard membrane feel. Just what I'm used to. I think if you've ever tried playing on the Fighting Commander Octa for just standard video games that aren't fighting games, it can be a little bit of a shock. It's like the travel is completely different on the buttons. Done. All right, what's my crazy ranking? Class C. Rubbish. How is this for a random assortment of games? Super Meat Boy. No, where's the stage with the good music? The hospital. Okay, run. Instantly, I'm now noticing something playing on a game like this. I feel like this analog stick is very, very close to the buttons. I don't notice it on a DualShock. When I'm on a DualShock and I'm like pressing these buttons and I'm holding down this button and I'm pressing cross to jump, I don't notice myself bumping into the analog stick, but I'm noticing on this one, it's feeling quite cramped because when you press on the X button on here, the pad of your thumb is also kind of pressing on this rim of this analog stick here. And also, I do feel like when when I'm jumping like this, I do sometimes knock the analog stick. Interesting that it's so close. If I really forced it, I can make it happen on a DualShock as well. Let's see if I can get used to this. Oh my goodness. How am I so bad at this game? I do feel like if it were an option to not have this analog stick be like right here, like the bump of it, like actually bumping into this button here, I feel like I would prefer if that were an option. Ah, why? Alright, made it to the end. Alright. Alright, well there you have it for the Horipad Pro. This is for the Xbox Series X or S, or you can also use it on Windows. I was playing it here on Steam today. Here are my main thoughts about this controller. It can do actually some pretty cool stuff because of the button mapping software. And as I assume it works similarly to the Fighting Commander, it means that it will bake those changes into the controller. So if you go over to someone else's console, it will still retain all of those customizations that you've put in using the software. So I think that's the main thing to take away with this controller. It's a $50 controller, which makes it kind of not especially budget, but also not especially expensive. It does say Pro in the title and has some Pro features like customizations. But on the face of it, the construction is actually pretty standard Hori stuff. Like, actually, basically, if you've tried the Hori Fighting Commander Octa, it's like this. But this is not an expensive controller. This is just a controller that has a very specific shape and feature set designed for fighting games and things like micro switches. However, when you're considering buying a Horipad Pro, you're basically comparing it against stuff that you would plug into just the general console. So a controller like DualShock 4 or DualSense or the Xbox Series X controller, those controllers come with the console and they've got a fairly good build. They usually run like $60, $70. I guess the way to think about this controller is it's an alternative to the official controller, and it says Pro in the title, but it's not especially, it doesn't feel especially luxurious. So it's like Pro in that you can do some cool stuff with it, but it's not like luxurious, like, oh man, if I'm going to go into a tournament and I want to have like the best possible piece of hardware. That's not what this is trying to be. I think if you're going to buy the Horipad Pro, you need to be very conscious of what you're buying it for. The reason you would buy this controller are: 1, you need a wired controller; 2, you like the idea of having 4 separate profiles; 3, you want a D-pad that is definitely functional and is, you know, quite popular. It's the one basically exactly the same as this one from the Hori Fighting Commander 1. And probably more important than all of that is the ability to do some pretty wacky customizations, like having a massive dead zone, or even if you go full throw on the analog stick, it only goes technically 80% of the way within the software. Or you can have it on that sort of instant D-pad mode, where even if you're moving it around like this, it will only lock itself into one of the 8 cardinal or diagonal directions. And also the ability to change like the sensitivity of these triggers, so you can have it activate more at the beginning of the travel or have it only activate right at the end of the travel. Generally speaking, it does the job, and I like knowing that it's got a D-pad that I'm familiar with, which is basically this one, right? But if I were to look closely at things that I'm not super keen on, one of the things that confuses me is, why doesn't it actually say wired controller on the box? Like, I think it's very possible that people are going to buy this controller thinking that it's just like the official controllers where they can run wired or wirelessly. But as far as I can tell, this is a wired only controller, but it doesn't actually say wired controller on the box. Obviously, you can see this thing sticking out the top of it on the box, so you should know. But I worry that people are going to pick this up and go, wait a minute, I can't actually connect it to my computer. Where's the Bluetooth button? It's like, actually, it's not a wireless controller. So personally, I think they should put that on the box. I think they should say Horipad Pro wired controller. Secondly, I totally understand that it doesn't come with an instruction manual, but when I downloaded the official instruction manual that it tells you to download, it actually doesn't tell you what the functions are in the software. Like dead zone adjustment, I kind of understand that, but it's not very clear in the software whether you can use dead zone adjustment and agile button settings at the same time. I tested it and it does work, but I think they should make that a little bit clearer. Secondly, target settings. Like, that is really vague. What does target settings mean? And what it's really referring to is, what is the maximum range of the analog stick? Will it go all the way 100% of the throw? Or if you push it 100% of the way, it'll only technically go like 80% or 50% of the full throw of the analog stick? Like, maybe I'm just new to this and maybe other software has been calling it target settings for a long time. But personally, you know, I just picked up this controller thinking, okay, I want to try out all the cool features of this new Pro controller that I've got. I have no idea what target settings means. Agile button settings also, it didn't really explain what that is. I tested it and I see that it basically turns the analog stick into a D-pad. I think maybe they could have explained it better, or they could have just called it D-pad mode. That would have been fine. And then last but not least, if we talk about the ergonomics of the controller, I think it feels quite nice in my hand. I don't know if it's going to match everyone's hands, but basically this feels like really nice for me. But this like raised up portion here, you can see that's like this like little control panel with the D-pad and the right analog stick. It's raised up ever so slightly, and so there's a ridge right here. And so I feel like when you're moving your hand around, like you've got your thumb on the X button and you're flexing it to press the jump button, like I was in Super Meat Boy. I did feel like I was bumping up against this ridge here, and that was kind of bothering me. And also, every now and then I was also bumping the analog stick. I don't think the analog stick is significantly closer to the buttons than, you know, on a standard DualShock controller, but for whatever reason, maybe just the height of this analog stick, or just the proximity, or just the shape of the buttons, or the way that I'm pressing them, I did feel like I was either bumping into the analog stick, not so often, but I was definitely I definitely felt like this ridge of this little panel here, and I felt like that was getting in my way. And one last thing that I felt was a little bit strange was I think the way that I'm holding this controller, even though it felt like quite comfortable, I did feel like my fingers overhang the trigger buttons. And also, if you like check out these triggers, they're kind of triangular shaped. So when you push on the very end of the trigger, you're pushing on like the very tip of a triangle as opposed to pressing on the like flat portion of a trigger like this. I mean, this is all just sort of design preference. Honestly, even on a DualShock, you can see like the triggers aren't especially large. It's not like they have a huge amount of surface area. I'm not really sure if this triangle shape is working for this controller, but hey, maybe this is a tried and tested shape and other people like it. I'm just not particularly used to it myself. All right, that's all for the Horipad Pro. Definitely check this controller out if you're interested in an alternative to the official Xbox and PlayStation controllers, and you need a wired controller that has, you know, a D-pad that you know and love from the original Fighting Commander. It definitely gets the job done, and it has a huge amount of customizability that you can get from the Hori device manager software that you can download for your computer. And it bakes those profiles into the controller, so even if you take it to someone else's console, you'll still have your custom changes that you've made, like having this be, you know, reversed up and down, or having the left stick swapped with the right stick. Should be convenient to be able to bring those profiles with you wherever you go. If you're interested in other videos that I've made on pad controllers and or arcade sticks, do check out other videos on the channel. Make sure you're subscribed. You can join us on Discord to talk about gear and you know video games and fighting games in Japan or whatever it is you want to talk about. Follow me on Twitter as well if you'd like to. And until the next NihongoGamer video, I'll see you around.